On the 28th of February, a war broke out on the other side of the world, and the Philippines started dying from it.
ISIS has said basically, now that it's difficult to get to Syria, wage war at home.
When the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran, Tehran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, cutting off roughly one-fifth of the world's entire oil supply. Most countries felt the shockwave, but the Philippines felt it like a knife. Fuel prices rose week after week, 11, 12, 13 consecutive weeks of increases, one of the longest streaks in the country's modern history. Diesel blew past 130 peso per liter. Gasoline crept toward 100 pesos. Kerosene, the fuel that millions of poor Filipino households cook with, hit 157 pesos. And then on March 24th, President Marcos did something no leader in the world had done yet. He declared a state of national energy emergency, making the Philippines the first country on earth to do so. But here's the thing. The emergency declaration is just the headline. The real story is what it reveals about a country whose economic foundations were already cracking before a single missile was ever fired. So, is this a temporary shock the Philippines can absorb? Or is something more fundamental breaking?
Dapat bigay din sa amin.
To understand why this crisis hit the Philippines harder than most, you need to understand one number. 98%. That's how much of its oil the Philippines imports. Almost all of it from the Middle East. That's not just a vulnerability. That's a structural dependency that was always going to become a crisis the moment the Middle East lit up. And unlike oil-producing neighbors, the Philippines has no hedge, no sovereign wealth fund, no domestic reserves to draw on. The country lacks the strategic reserves and fiscal tools to shield consumers. As countries in Southeast Asia scramble to respond, the Philippines is not in a good place, and the timing could not be worse. The country was already carrying wounds from years of high inflation, a weakening peso, and post-pandemic debt. Then came the Hormuz closure, and the slow bleed became a hemorrhage. Just like every major economic crisis, this one isn't a single event. It's a cascade, and it hits the Philippines in three distinct layers: transport, households, and the government itself. The Philippines runs on fuel, not metaphorically, literally. Electric vehicle use remains minimal. Most commodities are transported by ships, trucks, buses, jeepneys, and tricycles that all run on diesel or gasoline. Every time pump prices go up, the cost of moving anything, food, medicine, goods, goes up with it. For the millions of jeepney and tricycle drivers who are the backbone of Filipino public transport, the math has become impossible. Roughly 80% of their take-home pay is now being consumed by fuel costs. These aren't abstract statistics. These are people choosing between filling their tank and feeding their families. Transport unions have already planned strike actions. Workers, commuters, and consumer groups organized a two-day strike to protest the fuel increases and what they called the government's failure to respond quickly enough. Fuel prices in the Philippines don't just affect drivers, they affect everything. More than 36% of the Philippine consumer price basket is tied to oil prices. When diesel spikes, freight costs spike. When freight costs spike, food prices follow. When food prices spike, the poorest Filipinos, who already spend the majority of their income on basic goods, get squeezed hardest. Economists warn that GDP growth could slow to as low as 3.5 to 4% in 2026 under a worst-case scenario of $200 per barrel. What they're calling a triple whammy of inflation, budget deficit, and reduced government spending. Energy research firm Wood Mackenzie has predicted that if the war continues, Brent crude could climb as high as $150 a barrel in coming months, and warned that an average of $125 a barrel for the year would be enough to trigger a global recession. The Philippines would not be watching that recession from the sidelines. This is where it gets really uncomfortable, because the government's response options are limited, and every option has a cost. President Marcos has asked Congress to grant him emergency powers to suspend or reduce excise taxes on petroleum products, but he has yet to sign the measure, citing complex fiscal calculations. Senators are eyeing a reduction or full suspension of the 12% VAT on petroleum products as further relief. But reducing fuel taxes means foregone revenues, and that threatens the country's credit rating. The government is caught in a trap of its own structure. Cut taxes to ease the pain, and you blow a hole in the budget. Keep taxes, and you let ordinary Filipinos drown. There is no clean answer. Now, you might be thinking, every country is struggling with this. Why is the Philippines special? The answer is resilience, or more precisely, the lack of it. A country like Japan or South Korea gets hit by the same oil shock, and yes, it hurts. Japan launched its biggest ever release of emergency oil reserves. South Korea launched a nationwide energy conservation campaign, asking citizens to take shorter showers and avoid charging devices at night. These are painful measures, but those countries have buffers, strategic reserves built over decades, diversified energy mixes, high-income households that can absorb short-term price spikes. The Philippines has almost none of that. As of March 20th, the Department of Energy reported the country had an average of 45 days of oil supply, down from 55 to 57 days when the war started just a month earlier. The clock is ticking, and in desperation, the government has turned to unusual sources. Petron Corporation ordered 700,000 barrels of oil from Russia, taking advantage of a 30-day U.S. waiver on purchasing sanctioned Russian petroleum. This is what energy emergency looks like in practice. Not a clean government press release, a scramble. And here's what gets lost in all the economic language. The Philippines is a country of over 110 million people. And the numbers behind that headline tell a brutal story. Around 4.8 million Filipinos cannot afford a basic food basket. Another 27.7% of the population sits just above the national poverty line, meaning one bad shock away from falling through it. And a fuel crisis is exactly that kind of shock. They don't have savings cushions or investment portfolios. They have daily wages. In the national capital region, the daily minimum wage sits at 645 pesos, but a family of five needs 1,223 peso a day just to meet basic living costs. That gap, nearly double, existed before pump prices blew past 130 peso a liter.
Rallying and marching towards the presidential palace, calling for higher wages, double the national minimum wage as oil prices.
Now that gap is a chasm. Poverty incidence among farmers stands at 30%, and among fisher folk at 30.6%. The two groups whose livelihoods run almost entirely on diesel. Every fishing trip, every tractor, every delivery truck is now a financial calculation that is getting harder to solve. When fuel doubles, the tricycle driver earns less. When the tricycle driver earns less, the market vendor sells less. When the market vendor sells less, the supplier ships less. And when everything costs more to move, the family at the end of that chain pays more for rice, fish, and vegetables, with money they don't have. Over 90% of low-paid workers in the Philippines are employed informally, meaning no safety nets, no subsidies, no employer buffer. When the price of fuel rises, they absorb it entirely themselves. Over 60% of Filipinos are considered at high risk from climatic and economic shocks, with limited social protection systems leaving most households deeply vulnerable. Fuel prices act as a regressive tax on every one of those households. The word regressive is economic jargon for something very simple. The people who can least afford it pay the most. And in the Philippines right now, there are tens of millions of people who cannot afford it at all. The Philippines is not going to collapse. Let's be clear about that. It has survived colonial rule, dictatorship, multiple financial crises, devastating typhoons, and a global pandemic. The Filipino capacity to adapt and endure is real and hard-won. The government released 20 billion pesos from the Malampaya Gas Fund to the Department of Energy to secure fuel supply. The Department of Agriculture activated 1 billion pesos from its Quick Response Fund, allocating 500 million pesos in fuel subsidies to fisherfolk and another 500 million pesos for fertilizer procurement. These are real responses, but subsidies and emergency funds treat the symptom, not the disease. The disease is a structural overdependence on imported fossil fuel from one of the world's most volatile regions, with no serious domestic energy alternative, no deep strategic reserves, and a government whose fiscal room to maneuver is narrow. The Iran war didn't create that disease. It just made it impossible to ignore. In a matter of weeks, the Iran war has generated massive uncertainty about the future of the Middle East and rocked the global economy. Every major stock market has fallen since the war started, and economists have projected that a drawn-out conflict could cause inflation to spike and undermine economic growth worldwide. For countries with buffers, that's a rough patch. For the Philippines, that's an existential stress test. The Philippines sold the world a story: young workforce, rising growth, emerging economy. For a while it was true, but a story built on cheap imported oil, with no plan for when it stops flowing, was always going to face a moment like this. The war may end, the strait may reopen, prices may ease, but the 98% import dependency, the razor-thin reserves, the household's one price spike from poverty, those don't disappear when the guns go quiet. And right now, something is going seriously wrong.